you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read it, you're misinformed. What is the long-term effect of too much information?
Information, I just need some information. I've been dying. Is it lack of education? I've been reading without any transformation. I'm addicted. Is it overstimulation? Hey.
Welcome to the Sixth Sense Report.
Hear ye, come one, come all. You are listening to the Sixth Sense Report with Joel Nikoloff and Darnell Samuels.
And there's one extra today, bro. Who is it?
Well, we got a special guest in the Sixth Sense Report studio. Our intern, Stefan Dindayal, a.k.a. the Econ Don. Welcome, brother.
Welcome. Glad to be here, guys. Glad to be here.
Okay, so for the listeners, this show is about the Canada's Colour Coded Income Inequality report. So we're going to be looking at that and looking at the statistics that they crunch. And Stefan's a statistics guy and Joel's a statistics guy. So we figure we look at how to analyze statistics for those who don't know how to. And so we're going to be looking at control factors and looking at stats. And we're going to look at the correlation and causality. And we're also going to look at alternative solutions. So before we jump in, Steph, why don't you give everybody a background on who you are?
So first of all, my name is Stefan Dindayal. I'm a Canadian by birth, Guyanese by background, Indian by origin. That's what I always say. My field of study is economics, so I hold a master's degree in economics and an undergrad degree in financial economics. Some of the research I've done research on competitive markets, research on poverty, research on gun control policy, and I also have a lot of interest in other policy issues such as labor and healthcare. Primarily, what I specialize in is doing fundamental sound research to support and make policy claims. So this is exactly up my alley.
Okay, cool. And just also... yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to point out, just to differentiate, me and Stefan don't, although we both have economically minded perspectives, we do have some areas of disagreement. So although we may agree when we get into the conversation today, there is an aspect to recognize that we're bringing him on because we do represent different camps to some extent within the economic realm. He definitely wouldn't resonate with my ANCAP perspective.
Oh,
say.
yeah. I do not.
Right, but also, you know, you're also a Christian. So also, like, where do you fall on your theological?
I believe in everything the Bible says.
Okay. So what about word of faith?
You got to push more people. Word of faith? No. How about faith in His word?
That's the best answer.
Oh yeah.
I was going to get a little more technical and say, whatever it can be reconciled to His word, we're good.
Oh yeah.
But,
that's what I said.
You know, you said it much more eloquently.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Okay. So let's jump in. So from the jump, Steph, what stood out to you in regards to this report? And then Joel, you jump in.
Okay, so the very first thing that jumped out to me is one of the things I always do when I look at a paper is I look at the data that they're reporting, and I also look at what the paper or what the author is doing with the data. So looked at the paper, saw the data, and then I'm looking to see what are they actually doing with the data, and realized that they did almost absolutely nothing. They just reported the raw data. And just to give an example, one of the reasons why that is a big issue is because we live in a complex world where so many things cause so many things. So to just compare the data raw, when I mean raw data is just a figure for unemployment with another figure for unemployment. There's so many other things and other factors that can cause those figures to be different. And if you don't control for that, you're not really seeing what's causing the differences. We're left just assuming that there's a difference, right? If you take any 2 points of data, of course they're going to be different, right? No human being is identical to another human being. So of course you're going to find differences in data. What we have to learn to do when we're doing good research is find a way to model the data, to control for other factors that may make the things different, such that all we have left is race. And that's something I didn't see.
So to for the listener, the really simple way of thinking what you just said is it's a lot of times the data is really comparing apples and oranges. And we want to find factors that make it so that we're saying, okay, we've narrowed down the data such a way that we can say apples to apples.
Exactly.
And you know, if you we'll make sure in the show notes page you'll see the link to this. And Darnell already quoted the title. It's called Canada's Colour Coded Income Inequality, or I think you quoted it. If not, it'll be in the show notes page. Just to give the listener a super high level, we'll probably jump into a number of the tables and speak to different things. But for the most part, they focused on racialized populations, and compare it with non-racialized, which, unless I'm mistaken, essentially is just white people are the non-racialized.
We're left to assume.
So they took the racialized groups, which totaled, so this is from Stats Canada 2016. Essentially, their total population of racialized people is 7.6 million. So if I use a number of, I think the number, is it 35 million population in Canada? Is that roughly right now?
Yeah, I think that's roughly right.
Does that sound about right to you guys? So I think in essence we're talking about 1/5, give or take. Then, you know, for the most part, everything throughout this chart is really comparing unemployment, income inequality, you know, different factors about wealth that they try to compare racialized groups with with white people, and then they did break it out by men and women.
Yeah.
But to your, I thought the same thing. You know, I'm scrolling through these data tables. I was kind of skimming the words because for me, I just look at the numbers and go, I can tell what the numbers are saying right away. It's just kind of, I'm numerically inclined. So I can see differences. Things pop out to me right away. And I was really disappointed. I was hoping there was going to be an aspect of like, okay, here's what Stats Canada has, plus let's to your point, what you were talking about before. They didn't add anything to the data. There wasn't, oh, here's another, you know, study that's been done, and we're trying to merge the two pieces of data together, and here's where our concerns lie, or here's what we've learned. I find it kind of disappointing in the same that really for the most part they're presenting data that may or may not be important, and the reason I say may or may not be important, you'll understand when we start talking about the conclusions. But anybody else could pull this data again. Like literally this entire report is really just a republishing of specific Stats Canada data.
Yeah, exactly. It's like
with comments.
Yeah, they're getting away with a lot of plagiarism here. Or is that too extreme? Is that too extreme?
Well, why do you say that?
Because they cut and paste the Stats Canada data, in essence.
And so, like, because Stats Canada is just posting the stats, but they're not telling you exactly the correlation between the stats.
Well,
exactly.
I mean, I'm assuming Steph's being a little facetious because they didn't plagiarize the words.
Yeah,
they didn't plaarize the commentary.
Jesus.
He's just saying the numbers are literally cut and paste, or, you know, for the most part. I mean, I'm sure there's an aspect where they may, like, I'm not overly familiar with Stats Canada's data. I don't know that me and you as individuals should just go to their website and start pulling out these charts. They might have had to, you know, use the fact that they're a think tank and correlate, you know, get the raw data from Stats Canada to be able to play with it themselves and present it in this way.
Okay. So let me play advocate then. So how do I know that you guys aren't manipulating the numbers to make it say what you want to say? How do I know you guys aren't eisegeting the numbers, if that's a thing with statistics?
Well, I mean, it gets into this idea of cause and effect,
Okay.
right? So,
Oh, sorry, sorry, Joel. But I also want to note that we also talked about correlation of versus causation on climate change, Sola Greta on episode 55. So if you haven't heard that episode and heard us unpack that idea, you should check it out. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Joel.
yeah. So, I mean, the data is there, and in essence, where my frustration lies is, in essence, they're just they're controlling. The control here is, or the cause and effect they're saying is race. But as Steph and Steph, you can probably speak to, if when you went into this report, what were you, because based on the title, what kinds of things would you have been expecting them to, use as relevant causal factors to sparse out the data even further?
So first of all, just to what Darnell was saying, when it comes to the ideal of tricking people and playing with it, like in the world of people who know numbers and who know stats, like there's no hiding it. There's no hiding. You can see, even us, we can see what people are doing. So even when people control for factors, any economist who's worth his salt, any researcher who's worth his salt is going to show you what he's controlling for, or leave a link to his data set so you can see what he's controlling for. So these are things that people can actually see if you look further on what people are doing. Now, in response to Joel's question, the biggest thing I was thinking about would be what are factors that correlate with race that would cause a problem in the data if you're just showing non-racialized employment versus racialized employment. One of them I was thinking was immigration. So let's say in the data we're just comparing a white person who's lived in this country for 50 years and has built up experience and has had jobs for how long, and then now we're comparing with a group of individuals who are non-white who have just moved to Canada and haven't had the same amount of experience, right? You tend to see there's a correlation of more people who are non-white immigrating, and you'll see an effect there where, of course, if people are moving and have barely been in Canada to work and grow, won't have the same effect with a white person that's been here for so long. And this works well vice versa, right? Let's say you have someone who is non-white who's been in this country for so long versus someone from Ireland, someone from Europe who's white who emigrates to Canada. Mm-hmm. Right? You won't expect to see the same thing. What I would have wanted to see them do is break down and control for immigration. And then let's compare a white immigrant with a non-white immigrant, or all the different races there, or immigrants, or people who have been here longer, and control
years
for those
they've
things.
been in here.
Exactly.
Right? Years they've been here after being an immigrant.
Yeah.
Is there a difference between someone who's racialized and non-racialized?
Yeah. Yeah. And
I think that's a really good. I think that's a really good stat, because the only reason I want to jump in right now is just because they did put a little bit of stuff around immigration.
Yeah, a little bit.
I think it was table. Let me just get there. Table 8. I think I said it was.
Yeah. Generations.
And they talked about first generation, second generation, third generation. It has a little bit of, so this is table 7 and table 8. To some extent, that speaks to immigration and second generation, third generation immigrant. But your point, I think you laid it out perfectly, is it shows why this is incomplete, because a first generation immigrant racialized, first generation immigrant non-racialized is not compared.
Yeah, exactly.
and for the most part, there's let me read the conclusion, and I think for the audience it'll kind of become clear. I think the first two lines of the conclusion demonstrate what the entire data set that they presented, the goal, right? What they're trying, the argument that they're trying to present. So it says, our analysis demonstrates the persistence of patterns of employment and income inequality along racial and gender lines in the Canadian labor market. The data also underline the importance of understanding the distinct barriers faced by different racialized groups. And so, I think that second sentence saying understanding the distinct barriers, other than race, they have not demonstrated any barrier.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Exactly.
Are you saying like the barrier is assumed?
The barrier is assumed to only be race or gender. Right? It doesn't have to, what if English isn't a first language?
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Exactly. So the barrier is we need to help immigrants speak English.
Exactly.
How, the report, if you're worried about, again, and this is where, we've talked about it before, I'll say it a million times. What is the cause of the inequality? And understanding if the cause of the inequality is something that we deem problematic, it's problematic that they can't speak the language, right? So, okay, how do we help people who can't speak the language?
Mm-hmm.
That's a much different than just saying, well, I'm going to presume racism is the problem. If you could demonstrate that when I make an apple to apple comparison between a white guy or in this term, a non-racialized person and a racialized person that are equal in every facet. And obviously that's a really hard thing to do.
With
You're not
the
really
exception of race.
Exactly. So, okay, what are factors related to unemployment? What are factors related to income, right? What is the other thing poverty, but I guess that one they didn't really have a lot of data on. They spoke to it, but really it's income and unemployment are the two, most significant factors. And I almost want to say it's the only factors they talk about. Earnings gap, these, it's just different terminologies that they use. Average income. Yeah. So the point is, what are the things that for you as an individual, think about it. Okay. Over my life, what has caused my income to go up or down? Do I have a designation? Do I have a certificate? Do I have a diploma? Do I have years of experience? Do I have successes in my, past on my resume that can say, hey, I have a higher ability than my cohorts, than my peers, right? All of these things that you can talk to, years of experience, as I've said. Did I have to take a leave of absence? Am I looking at your resume? If every 9 months you take 3 months off and then you start a new job, you're going to get less pay because the employer's not really doesn't look at you as someone they want to invest in, because clearly you don't want to invest in them. At least that's the perception. Mm-hmm. Right? So these are factors that play a role in employment. If I'm trying to say that there's a racial issue, I need to demonstrate that when I've controlled for these factors that impact income, then there's still a difference. And the difference is statistically significant.
Yeah.
And the reason I use the term statistically significant is because, saying a 1 or 2% difference, mm-hmm. I mean, essentially you can have a sampling problem.
Exactly.
So what do you mean by a sampling problem?
So within statistics, there's always this idea that you're getting a representative sample, right? So if I'm trying to survey 35 million people, I don't actually survey 35 million people. Mm-hmm. I collect 2 million, 3 million surveys, mm-hmm. And now I extrapolate. Mm-hmm. The problem is that 3 million is called the sample population. If the sample population isn't representative of the total population, you're going to have statistical errors. Mm-hmm.
Basically, the higher the sample, the better, the closer it is.
Right, because if I had 100% sample, I have no statistical error.
No error.
assuming that I have perfect information on the people that I've sampled.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's another piece of error is like sometimes people will tell you the answer they think you want to hear, or the answer they want to give because they're, they want to present themselves in the best possible light, even though nobody even knows who they are when they're being surveyed.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like you might lie on a survey. Again, it's going to cause statistical error. But that's why as the number increases, you essentially can say, okay, those components of errors get minimized.
Mm-hmm. Well,
but that's why I said statistically significant. If I said, the difference is 2% wage gap, I can't do much with that because there's a potential it's statistically just an error.
Yeah. Also, there could also be something that's a difference that we have yet to observe yet.
Yes.
like what?
So
an uncontrolled
we have yet to
factor.
observe it, some factor. So, for example, economists will always say, we've done all the controlling for the gaps, and they will say, if there is whatever gap there is left unexplained in the data.
Mm-hmm.
So they would say, it's up to you to decide now, whatever's left unexplained, is that race, or is whatever we're looking at, or is it some other factor that we haven't looked at? So, for example, just to look at an example for gap between men and women. If we're looking at the gap between men and women, one of the things we can look at is negotiation ability.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Do men have more of a tendency to negotiate and be more competitive to negotiate for a higher salary? As a whole, are women as competitive to negotiate for a higher salary? Back in the day, if economists were not accounting for that, or not even thinking that negotiation can have an effect with something like that, then they wouldn't include it as a control. They wouldn't include it in their data. So then what would happen is, of course, if that is a factor, it would show up as a difference. Right? So if you're not including it in your model, you're going to have a gap.
Right. So sorry, but I want to also hold on. I just want to add that, like, looking at racism as the problem for the gap, and it spearheading the problem. So, for example, a potential reason why somebody might not be able to get a job is because, like, the minority might not have as great an education as the white person, and the reason why they don't have as good as education is because of racism. Or the reason why the person is disadvantaged is because of racism, and that's why they can't qualify for these jobs. So racism, it still comes back to racism.
Well, but I think you need to look so this would say, okay, let's say you're identifying what you're actually, like the example you've given is what you're identifying is two things. One, they have a lack of experience and they have a lack of education.
Because they're black, or because they're
but
of their
like
of
step
color,
one,
skin.
Yeah.
So step one would be in the data set that we're looking at right now.
Mm-hmm.
You would add levels of education and you would add levels of experience, and you start to identify that within the black community, these two factors are really low. Okay, so now I need to dig deeper on and start to say, what is the cause in that population group that makes it different? It might be racism. That's a reasonable hypothesis, but now you need more data to substantiate. Right?
Well, so hold on. So is it circular reasoning for me to say, well, to substantiate it is there's inequality, so it must be racism?
No, because you
is that
have
circular
identified
reasoning that I'm using?
The problem is you're like, is it circular reasoning? I don't. Circular reasoning is a little bit more like, because I'm black, therefore because I'm black. Like, it's what I mean is, we're saying, there's income inequality in the races. But then when we control for education and when we control for what was the other one? Years of experience, we find that black men who have the same years of experience make the same as white men. And we find that black women who have the same years of experience and same education make the same as white men. And actually statistically we find that they make more because they're in higher demand. But that's a whole nother ball game that listeners are going to be like, what? Anyways, So what we have found is that race, when you control for these factors, actually doesn't play a role. But what we do find is that the black race has a higher proportionality of low experience, low education.
Why?
And then once we
That's
find
a great-
that's a separate study.
But that's where you need to
yeah.
dig into what are the factors. So now look at the black community. What are the factors within the black community for the people who have high education, high experience? What are the differentiating factors for who has low experience? Because arguably, the guy who has a lot of experience and a lot of education might say, well, I experienced racism as well. And maybe the level of racism was exactly the same. So then the question goes, well, okay, so what was different in this person if they let's say arbitrarily, I'm just kind of, let's say they experienced racism 10% of their life. I don't know, I'm just making that up. Right? But that was across the board the norm for all black people. But there's disparity in outcome between black people.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them have high education, some of them have low education, some have high experience and low experience. So the question becomes, why? If they've experienced the same amount of racism, it can't be racism.
Yeah.
Because everybody would have had the low number. Now, it may be a component of the factor, right? Like maybe the reason why the proportionality is what it is, you would have to say, well, black people have a lower access to education. Or, if the government was causing, certain groups of people to all live in the same place, and then you identified that those schools had lower quality teachers and lower paid teachers, like now you could start to say, okay, well, the government has been doing X, Y, and Z. That's leading to a lower quality of education because we can tell that the school systems that these particular people group are in is of lower quality.
Yeah. And this is exactly why I'm pointing back to the importance of controlling for things in this study. Because if they were able to control for more things, we'd actually get more information, right? Because when you're doing research, you should come to the conclusion of, I know when you're doing research, you should try to be as unbiased as possible, but we all have our biases. But your real attempt and your mentality for research should be like a detective, right? And nowadays there are people who want to prove their point, right? They already have an argument in view and they want to try and use the research to prove their point. In reality, what you should be doing is coming across saying, I don't know what this data is going to tell me, but let's control for as much things as possible and let's see what's actually causing the biggest change. Their approach should have been, is there a gap period between these things? And if there is, what is causing the gap?
But if we read,
is it rate?
But if we read the Twitter profile of the group, it says independent, nonpartisan research on social, economic, and climate justice. So to some extent, they're telling you their bias up front.
Exactly.
Even though it says nonpartisan.
Yeah.
Well, nonpartisan means that they basically that they're not endorsed by a particular party.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But they're partisan if you think that like they're left leaning. If left is a partisanship to you, well then they're partisan.
Yeah. So the goal
Right.
should have been, what is causing these differences, if they are differences, and be open to think, oh, maybe there's no difference, or be open to think, if there is difference, what is the biggest cause? Is it a difference in experience? Is it a difference in immigration? Is it a difference in language barrier, which also affects education, right? You can't be as educated if you're struggling just to learn the language that the teacher is speaking to you, right? What are the different things? And then once we break it down further, okay, maybe we found something that is a huge difference. Maybe it is experience or education. Then from that point, then that should lead us to a separate study where we say, now, why is it that there are differences in education between that? And then that's the hard work of doing research.
Yeah. And I think that when you look at it from that perspective in regards to like incentive for, agenda pushing, like the implications are huge in regards to, like, for example, like what Joel said, racism, all black people experience racism, let's say, but there's different outcomes. There's disparity among black people because there's black people who are doing well and who are thriving, and then there are those who don't. But that's not part of the conversation because politically, it's a great argument for getting funding for policies or whatever the case may be, or elections. But if there really is black people who are thriving despite the inequality that we see, we have to start factoring, okay, well, why is that group of black people doing well? Like, start factoring in, okay, well, is it family? Is it a particular people from a particular country? And so forth. So it gets pretty deep. So like,
go ahead.
Not to
one thing I want to say is like, I thought when I started looking at the data, like I was going to ask you guys this question, but the question I'm going to ask you, but I'll answer it for myself first is, was there anything when you were looking at this that started to stand out at you? And the reason why that's an interesting question is because there are data points in here. So I thought this report did a good job of actually, like, the way the data is parsed out by race and by men and by women starts to say, hey, that's a peculiar data point. Oh, that's a peculiar data point. Like, why are those what they are? And like, table 4 is one of them. And I think table 8, which I referenced earlier, table 4 is unemployment, employment, and participation rates by racialized group. What is, like, when you look at this chart, the numbers are all over the place, right? And so, but they're being compared with non-racialized population. So, question becomes, for the people groups that have unemployment rates below non-racialized or white people, that's interesting. And you got some, so the non-racialized population was 8.2% unemployment. But then you've got Filipino men, that was unemployment rate for men was 8.2%. You got Filipino men at 5.8% and Filipino women at 4.7% compared to 6.4 white women. And you're like, those are really low numbers. Why? And like, just turns out that they also have really high participation rates. That's also kind of peculiar. There are some, like, black unemployment rate is really high, but so is Arab unemployment rate. Like,
it's all over.
Similarly, you've got some West Asian men don't have a high rate. I mean, it's a little bit higher, but then West Asian women is really high. It's like, okay, well, what's peculiar? And I'm speaking totally like pure hypothetical right now. Maybe culturally, West Asian women don't work before having kids. That could be an explanatory factor. But like, I don't know anything about the culture group. I don't even really know when it says West Asian. Okay, I'd have to look at a map and start kind of figuring out what that even, what are the countries being referenced there. But my point is to say, like, I just randomly came up with a hypothesis. I could be totally wrong. But that's the kind of thing where, like, oh, hey, here's a peculiar data point. Let me start it in statistical terms. We start using more dimensions. It's more characteristics about, the data or the people that are underlying the data to say what makes them different, what makes them different, what makes them the same. Yeah, and you start to control for those things to be able to say, oh, apples to apples. Mm-hmm. So, I started my ramble with the question, was there anything for you guys that you stood out and went, oh, that's a really interesting data point?
Well, it was the one where you look at the Koreans, Filipinos, some of the Asians. You could easily isolate the data and say, wow, like, it seems like Asians are doing better than white people.
And that was that's in table 8. That's average.
Table 8. Yeah, if you look at the table 8, first generation, second generation, third generation. If you look at the Korean and Japanese, you're seeing that by the time they get to third generation, they're outperforming by 1.
Koreans are outperforming 1.5%.
Yeah,
okay,
1.24.
So Steph, so why would you? So what are you deducing from that?
Well, if I'm just looking at the data, I'm like, oh, it seems like there's discrimination against. You can make the case and say, oh, there's discrimination against white people if Asians are doing better, or you can even go the other way and say Asians are getting favorable treatment.
Well,
in this case,
we know
If you
that's
just
not
look-
true.
If you just look at the data, you could say, oh, Koreans and Japanese are getting favorable treatment if we use the same. Because if you're willing to say that the groups that are doing worse than white people are being discriminated against, then it's a double-edged sword. You have to go the other way and say that the groups that are doing better than the white people, they're getting some type of favor. You can't have it both ways.
Yeah, but that's what we've been talking about.
That's because you can't have white racism.
Because we talked about like the ideology of social justice. So that like that's almost it's almost like an economic principle to interpret disparity, right? So anything that's white, male, Christian, heterosexual is the problem. And so that's the factor of why we see all the problems. Any problem we have is because of one of those factors. Get rid of Christianity, get rid of men, get rid of heterosexuals, get rid of white people, and everything will be better. But that's not even an economic principle, right? It's just a social ideology.
And arguably, it's, I mean, and this is where, like, for people who hear the term cultural Marxism and don't understand it, like, this is because you're making that group that you just described, which essentially is me, out to be, which you're. So Marxism,
Non-racialized.
yeah. Marxism is essentially creating an oppressed and an oppressor, and anyone who ticks those boxes that you've just labeled, well, they're the oppressor. Therefore, we need to overthrow them. And so, to your point, like, yeah, it is an economic principle, but it's economics of socialism or Marxism that, from an economics perspective, has been largely debunked since the 50s as a good economic system. It's literally the only thing Marxism holds on to now is inequality.
Yeah, and the thing with cultural Marxism is is that it already frames oppressor versus non-oppressor. Okay, and just as we look here, what is already being framed as non-racial versus racial?
Yeah, but one of the things that I would conclude from the report, and like we talked about before, was like what was the potential solution, like the alternatives to the problem. So I'm the kind of person that, like, yes, we talk about the problem, but it's also good for you to pose a problem and then pose a solution, as opposed to being a negative Nancy or a negative Negro or whatever the case may be. So like the implications of their perspective usually leads to affirmative action and wealth redistribution as part of the solutions. So I was just like, okay, well, why weren't the other alternative perspectives being proposed? So if they're going to offer, if someone says, okay, affirmative action, well, what's an alternative to affirmative action? Right?
Well, so
hiring based on their merit, and then wealth redistribution versus, financial literacy and creating wealth and learning how to create wealth. Wealth isn't something that people steal, but it's something you create.
So basically the implications of all this when it comes to the solutions, the implication, in order for you to have a solution, you need to understand the problem. So in order to understand the problem, this all stems from the research. So I'm going to frame how they understand the problem. Based on how they report this, they're assuming that they've controlled for everything, or they're assuming that they don't have to worry about, they're presuming and presenting it that in such a way that everything is controlled for. Given that everything is equal, they're already just assuming that the issue and the problem is race and discrimination. So if the problem is race and discrimination, we have probably two solutions. One solution is try to stop racism, right? Try to stop people from actually discriminating against people. They know they can't do that, right? They know it's harder to do that. So then what's the other solution? If you can't stop people from being racist, then what you can do is just kind of reshift money and make laws like affirmative action and force people to kind of hire a certain number of racial people against their will, against their racial desires. Or have
And
like a
just-
tax rebate, something like that. That would be what they would
Yeah.
suggest if that's
Let me jump in, read the final paragraph of their conclusion, just because it demonstrates exactly what we're saying. What is their goal? So it says the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives has long advocated for policies that tackle economic inequality, including progressive taxation, taxation of wealth, and measures to address tax loopholes and tax havens. It has advocated for employment legislation that protect and adequately remunerate workers by raising minimum wage labor market standards like the minimum wage and addressing precarious employment conditions. It has also advocated for policies that would address systemic racism and sexism, like pay equity and employment equity. All of these policies are required to stop the deepening of economic inequality in Canada. So, I mean, essentially, more laws, more control, more legislation, more taxes. And as Stefan said, like, they've presented it like, here is the level of the or here's the way the problem exists, by saying here's the level of analysis that needs to be done and nothing further. Because they're not digging into they're not digging into
other causes.
the other factors. I mean, they within this conclusion, they had said something along the lines of, this inequality is entrenched and it goes on for generations. But when you look at the first and second and third generation statistics, it's actually trending the other way. It's trending away. It's trending towards, I'll use the term normalcy, but the idea that like they're actually trending as you get to more and more generations, they're closer to the non-racialized group.
Yeah, and that's consistent with what we've been saying. Right?
And it's
You're growing
inconsistent
in
with their
yeah,
conclusion.
Yeah, you're growing with experience. The third generations are growing with experience. The third generation grew up in this country. English is their first language. All these those different factors that started with the first generation are almost disappearing.
One of the problems is, like, if you have a culture, like, and I'm not trying, if anything I'm about to say is deemed to be, I'm referencing a particular
Racist?
culture. Well, no, but like my point is, if you think I'm talking about a particular culture, I'm not. I'm just making this up on the spot, pretty much. But if you have a culture that's only saving 5% of their income, and you have another culture that's has an aspect of saving, like living, bare bones, but saving like 25% of what they make, it doesn't matter any other factor. One of those cultures will be poor forever. The other one will continue to grow in wealth and prosperity. Right? Because really that 5% is really negative 6% because they're doing things on credit beyond and living beyond their means. Right? I use 5 and 25 to demonstrate, even if you're saving, if you only save 5%, but the other, and we're talking, I'm even saying the same income level. Somebody who's willing, you look at, there's cultures, there's families, they'll live in like, 3, 4, 5 families sometimes in a house, or you can just, you've got
Indian community.
five kids sleeping in one bedroom.
Yeah.
Right. Well, part of that is not living beyond their means. Part of it is, at sometimes necessity. But I know a buddy of mine who bought a house like 10 years ago, bought a house with his parents that actually had 2 master bedrooms. And I was like, that's so foreign to me. Now, he was a Sikh, and I don't know if culturally there was a normalcy to that, or if it was just a fact of like, hey, it made more sense for his life.
No. That's a trend within the Sikh community. And yeah, because like we talked about brown privilege on our last episode about how, Sikhs live different than other people.
Yeah, and essentially they reap a benefit for it because, as a result, you've got 2 income groups paying a mortgage. You've got 2 generations paying the same mortgage. And then, potentially that mortgage is paid off. My buddy moves out and buys another house.
Bruh. And then you have enough money to buy all these fly cars and invest. And so check out Brown Privilege episode 62. But so let me ask 2 cents. What's your 2 cents, Joel? And then we'll let Steph close out with his.
My 2 cents is that, this publication is surface level. For the listener, if you're thinking that we're not giving it a fair shake, I want to go back to the fact I think there's statistics in here that actually beg the question for more information. So it's not that I think that what they've done is not valuable at all, but I think it's a disgrace to leave it at the level that it's at, because if you, like Stefan said, if you want solutions, you really need to know the cause. And if you think it's racism, this level of analysis is insufficient to actually come to that conclusion, because you haven't compared apples with apples. People aren't the same.
Mm-hmm. And I would add that I'm seeing like a contradiction in the heart of the report, in that the assumption is that there's equality among people groups, but then I can only talk as a black male. But for black people, there's certain things we like to brag about that we're better than other people in. Mm-hmm. Right? Whether it's, we flyer than other people, we set the trends, we set the culture, we're cooler than everybody, we're more athletic than everybody. But, looking fly comes with a price. You know what I mean? Yeezys cost a lot of money.
Those Jordans, man.
A new hairdo costs a lot of money. We're not like other people. And as black people, we like to flex and we like to champion that we're not like them. But then when it comes to this report, the assumption is we're just like white people. So then the outcome should be the same. But no culture is the same. And that's the whole point I want the listener to walk away with, is that even cultures among black people vary. And I've said it before. Yeah. Jamaicans are not the same as Nigerians, because Jamaicans are faster, right? Nigerians are smarter. What? Jamaicans don't.
Boy.
No, I'm kidding. People like, what? What? No, but I'm sorry. I know. I'm playing. But the cultures are different. We cook different food. We enjoy different sports. We rock different clothing. It's different. So we can't even get a same outcome among black people in those stats, even in regards to work, and types of work, that industries that we're in. So that's why I would call it a contradiction to assume that, okay, we're all about equality, but we're not equal. The very essence of our nature does not make us equal, so we can't expect the equal outcome.
Yeah. Now, my 2 cents. So, like I was saying before, pretty much, why are we doing this? Why are we looking into issues that are policy related? The whole reason why we're looking into policy, and the Sixth Sense does this, is because it's issues that affect people. It's issues that affect Canadians. All right. So, especially when we're looking at issues that affect Canadians, that affect people, real policy issues, it should have a foundation of good research, right? In order for us to the whole reason we study policies is to bring solutions, and we want to bring solutions to actual problems. In order to bring solutions, we need to understand the problem, and in order to understand the problem, we have to have good research being done. All right. This is why as an economist, I can't stress enough the importance of good research and the importance of controlling things and seeing what's actually causing the problem, what's actually causing the difference. It's only then, until we can truly understand the problem, and that we can actually begin to bring about solutions. All right. And with this paper, they just already assumed it was race. It could be race, but they didn't. Like Joel said, they didn't do enough controlling for us to realize and come to the conclusion that it is race. What if the problem is something we haven't even conceived about, and we invest thousands and thousands and millions of taxpayer dollars to try and solve this problem? We're actually only making it worse. We're actually taking extra tax dollars from everybody, making them even more poorer, and still not solving the problem. So this is why it's important that we invest in more and more research, and I think this needs to be done more.
Yeah. Well said, Steph. I want to do a quick shout out to the reason why we did this show. One of our listeners, Grant Sutherland. So he's a longtime listener, and so he sent me the report, and he's just like, Sixth Sense needs to do an
Chop
episode
it
on
up.
this. Yeah. So he sent it. So to all the other six centers out there, if you guys stumble across an article you guys want us to review or look at and report on, please, that's what we're here for, and let us know. And so now we have Steph, one of our interns. If you want to join the 6 Cents Report team, and you want to join and be like a research consultant or statistics analyst or a social media manager, please send us your email, send us your resume, let us know, and we'd love to, add to the team and make a better product. If you love the show and you want to be a part of it, let us know. You can contact us at sixcentsreport@gmail.com or on our Facebook page or our Twitter page, 6 Cents Report. So, Steph, for the people, if they want to get in touch with you, how can they get in touch with you?
Okay, so I'm on Twitter and Instagram. You can reach me on Twitter at Stefan D Econ. So that's Stefan D, the letter D, and then Econ Don. It's the same also for Instagram.
Man, economics never looks so good, baby.
Oh yes, oh yes.
And I'll make sure to put that in the show notes page. 6 Cents makes change.
The Spirit of the Lord's here to give us victory in the midst of spiritual warfare. The Holy Spirit helps us fear the Lord, and He uses the word, no, that's the Spirit sword, to separate them's greatly absurd. This ain't word of faith, it's faith in His word.
I say don't miss this evening. Come get your seating. The Spirit's anointing is at the bishop's meeting.
No, this is deceiving. You can stay filled with the Spirit through prayer and scripture reading. To be led by the Spirits, to be led by the word. So be fed when you hear it, whether read or it's heard. To be led by the Spirits, to be led by the word. Be fed when you hear it, whether read or it's heard.